Coravanta coverage of big news about Blake Lively vs Justin Baldoni update. Judge rules for major unsealing of documents, get ready. First of all, subscribe my channel. Lars Harry opened the day the same way he always did, grounding himself in the routine of delivering the news for people heading out the door, coffee in hand, eyes half open, minds already tired before the workday even began. This was Coravanta, the place where stories collided, where pop culture bled into politics, where courtrooms, protests, football fields, and global power struggles all somehow existed in the same breath. He told the audience he had everything lined up for them, but the truth was that the day itself had already decided its own direction, and it was pulling everything toward one central gravity point, the escalating legal war between Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively. Judges had finally made a ruling that people on both sides had been waiting for, and the implications of it were enormous. Documents that had been hidden, sealed away from public view, were now being forced into the light, and Lars Harry could already feel the ripple effect this was going to have throughout the week. This wasn't just legal housekeeping. This was the kind of ruling that cracked narratives open, the kind that made publicists nervous, lawyers defensive, and fans obsessive. He laid it out plainly. This unsealing meant tea. It meant drama. It meant uncomfortable conversations that had previously lived behind attorney-client walls were now potentially about to become public record. And more than anything, it meant people might finally learn what was said behind closed doors, including communications involving Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively themselves. That alone was enough to make this case explode beyond the courtroom. But this wasn't the only update. Blake Lively had quietly made another strategic move, hiring a new lawyer whose background alone had set social media on fire. And then, because this was Coravanta and not some neatly packaged entertainment show, Lars Harry told them they'd also be talking about protests in Minnesota, a story that somehow managed to be both disturbing and strangely hopeful at the same time. And if that wasn't enough, the show would eventually veer into something that sounded almost unreal. The idea that the United States was once again floating the possibility of invading Greenland, dragging Europe, tariffs, and global alliances into the chaos. It was all connected, even if it didn't seem that way yet. He dove straight into the Blake Lively situation, because there was no easing into this one. The headline alone was enough to raise eyebrows. Blake Lively hires Jeffrey Epstein victim's lawyer ahead of Justin Baldoni trial. The attorney in question, Sigrid McCowie, was well known for representing Epstein's accusers, and her involvement immediately reframed the optics of the case. This wasn't just a contractual dispute anymore, at least not in the way Lively's camp wanted the public to see it. By bringing in a lawyer associated with some of the most emotionally charged and morally loaded cases of the last decade, Lively's legal team appeared to be positioning her not merely as a wronged actress, but as a woman subjected to a hostile environment, someone who needed protection rather than scrutiny. Lars Harry didn't pretend to know the internal calculus behind the move, but he questioned it openly. Was this about legal strategy, or was it about narrative control? Because those are not always the same thing. McCowie echoed Lively's claims almost verbatim, framing the case as one centered on a woman standing up against mistreatment and then being attacked for it. Lars Harry paused there, because words like attacked carry weight, and they mean very different things depending on context. Was Blake Lively being attacked by Justin Baldoni in any legal or professional sense, or was she facing criticism from online commenters who simply didn't buy her version of events? Those were two very different realities, and the case would eventually hinge on which one could be proven. Lars Harry questioned why there would be any coordinated effort to sabotage a lead actor in a production. What would the incentive even be? Sabotaging your own project made no sense unless there was something else going on beneath the surface, something that hadn't yet been fully exposed, and that was where the judge's ruling came in like a hammer. The case, formerly titled Blake Lively vs. Wayfair Studios, which included Baldoni and other associated parties, had reached a procedural crossroads. The court was now weighing multiple requests from both parties and even non-parties regarding which materials should remain sealed and which should be unsealed. These materials were tied to Lively's motion for spoliation sanctions, a legal maneuver accusing the opposing side of improperly handling or destroying evidence. Lars Harry was quick to admit he wasn't a lawyer, but he understood enough to know that sealing and unsealing documents was never a neutral act. It always benefited someone more than someone else. From what he could see, most people on Baldoni's side wanted transparency. They wanted those documents unsealed. They wanted the public to see exactly what was said, especially communications involving Ryan Reynolds. Lively's argument was that her husband's conversations were private and irrelevant, that they were no one else's business. Baldoni's legal team disagreed, arguing that Reynolds had allegedly attempted to weaponize his influence, particularly through William Morris Endeavor, one of the most powerful talent agencies in Hollywood. If that was true, then those communications weren't just marital chatter. They were potentially part of the case itself. The judge ultimately ruled in favor of unsealing significant portions of the documents. Oral arguments on Wayfair's motion for summary judgment and Lively's motion for sanctions were scheduled for Thursday, January 22nd. Lars Harry made sure viewers marked their calendars, because this wasn't going to be a quiet court date. The public would have the right to attend and follow along, and crucially, they'd be able to do so using unredacted summary judgment materials unless continued sealing could be justified. That last part mattered. It meant the default position was now transparency, not secrecy. The court even provided what it called bottom-line conclusions to give the parties enough time to re-redact and refile materials appropriately before the hearing. That alone suggested the volume and sensitivity of what was about to come out. Lars Harry could feel it. Thursday wasn't just another procedural step. It was the moment when the meat and potatoes of the case would be laid out for public consumption. Addresses and truly private information might stay sealed, sure, but the substance, the conversations, the strategy, the alleged pressure campaigns, that was all likely coming out. He reminded viewers to stay tuned, because once these documents were public, there would be no walking it back. And then, almost casually, he pivoted to a completely different note, mentioning how insane the previous weekend had been. One video had exploded to 12 million views across TikTok and Instagram, something that still felt surreal to him. And it hadn't even been about Hollywood. It had been about Minnesota. That alone told him something important about the moment they were living in. People weren't just hungry for celebrity drama. They were desperate to make sense of the gaslighting, the rewriting of history, the insistence that they shouldn't believe their own eyes and ears. Before diving deeper into that, Lars Harry acknowledged the New England Patriots shirt he was wearing, a small but meaningful personal note. Sports had a way of grounding people, of offering a shared language that transcended politics, even if only temporarily. The AFC Championship was coming up, and the weekend's games had been nothing short of dramatic. Broncos star Bo Nix had suffered a broken ankle in a game that still somehow ended in a Broncos victory, sending shockwaves through fans. The Broncos would host the Patriots next Sunday, but the injury overshadowed everything. Lars Harry took a moment to empathize with Buffalo Bills fans too, acknowledging the questionable calls that had gone against them. Rivalries aside, some fan bases just seemed perpetually cursed, and Buffalo was one of them. The Patriots' own game against the Texans had been ugly, a defensive slog that left no one particularly happy. But Lars Harry wanted to highlight something else that had happened recently, something that had barely registered in mainstream sports coverage. Houston Texans linebacker Azeez Ulshaw had been fined over $11,000 by the NFL for writing "Stop the Genocide" on his eye black. Lars Harry understood the league's position. Uniform rules existed for a reason. Without them, the sport would descend into chaos, with every player promoting their own cause. But he also recognized the significance of someone willingly paying that fine to make a statement. He shared Ulshaw's words, where the player explained that what was happening in the world was bigger than him, that discomfort was nothing compared to the suffering of others. Lars Harry didn't shy away from stating where he stood. He believed a genocide was happening in Palestine. He also acknowledged the existence of terrorist organizations and violence against Israeli civilians. These things weren't mutually exclusive. But the scale of civilian death, especially among women and children, was undeniable. And the idea that Gaza might be bulldozed and transformed into some grotesque, Trump-sanctioned resort wasn't some fringe conspiracy. It was being openly discussed in policy circles. Ulshaw had worn the message again during pre-game but was told he'd be pulled from the game if he wore it during play. He complied, understanding the consequences, but Lars Harry respected the stand nonetheless. He supported people who used their platforms to speak about uncomfortable truths, whether that meant addressing genocide, police brutality, or the increasingly aggressive actions of ICE. These were divisive topics precisely because they mattered. Then his tone shifted. He spoke about the climate of fear that had begun to creep into everyday life. A Washington Post reporter had been raided. Lars Harry found himself carrying his passport everywhere, installing new security cameras, not because he wanted to live in fear, but because this was the reality now. When a video could rack up 12 million views overnight, it was fair to wonder who was watching and why. He wasn't claiming persecution. He was acknowledging uncertainty. And uncertainty, when paired with unchecked power, was dangerous. He emphasized that he didn't want people to be afraid. He wanted them to be aware. Conversations about pop culture, politics, and power weren't optional luxuries anymore. They were necessities. Without the rights people fought for, those conversations wouldn't exist at all. And that brought him to a story that seemed almost too surreal to be true, involving a self-professed white supremacist and January 6th rioter named Jake Lang, also known as Jeremy Lang. Lang had shown up in Minnesota with the stated intention of burning the Koran, framing it as a protest against what he called a Somali invasion of Minneapolis. Lars Harry noted, with careful precision, that while burning a book might fall under protected speech, inciting violence did not. What made Lang particularly unsettling was his background. He had been arrested for his role in January 6th, accused of assaulting a police officer with a baseball bat, and later pardoned by Trump. Now he was roaming the country, provoking communities already under immense stress. Lang tried to rally people, but protesters quickly surrounded him, backing him into a corner near a building. The situation escalated rapidly. Lars Harry described it as wild, chaotic, and dangerously close to turning lethal. But then something unexpected happened. A couple of young black men, fully aware of Lang's hatred and ideology, intervened, not to protect his beliefs, but to remove him from harm. They understood something deeper, that responding to hate with more hate would only feed the cycle. This moment stood in stark contrast to the narrative being pushed by those in power, who wanted to paint protesters as paid agitators or mindless mobs. What Lars Harry saw instead were people pushed to the brink by relentless pressure, ICE raids, tear gas deployed against civilians, children barely surviving encounters that should never have happened. And yet, even in that environment, there were people choosing love over violence. One of the men who helped Lang escape spoke openly about moving through the world with love and unity, invoking Jesus, Yahweh, and the idea that forgiveness was stronger than retaliation. Lars Harry reflected on how contagious emotions were, how love could spread just as easily as anger if given the chance. Fear and rage led people to do unspeakable things, and those emotions were often deliberately cultivated by governments seeking control. He argued that the chaos in Minnesota wasn't the result of foreign invasion or natural disaster. It was manufactured. An unforced error created for theater. He pointed to figures like Greg Bovino and others staging militarized marches with cameras rolling, dressed in replica Nazi-style gear, crafting propaganda meant to project power. These were not organic moments. They were scripted displays designed to provoke, to justify crackdowns, to create the illusion of authority even as public support eroded. Lars Harry drew parallels to similar spectacles staged in El Salvador, where prisoners, many of them innocent, were paraded for drone shots and propaganda films. It was all about visuals, about dominance, about sending a message. And it was unraveling. At this point, he told viewers that strikes were being planned later in the week and that America's relationships with world leaders were deteriorating rapidly. That was where the next story would go. A bizarre and escalating tariff war, reignited by Trump, aimed at some of America's closest allies. Tim Miller had described it as unimaginably deranged, and Lars Harry agreed, alliances fraying, and the sense that everything, from celebrity lawsuits to global trade wars, was part of the same unraveling thread. Lars Harry picked the thread back up without missing a beat, because this was one of those moments where everything started to blur together, where politics stopped feeling abstract and instead became something you could feel in your grocery bill, in your gas tank, in the quiet anxiety people carried around without even realizing it. The tariff war Trump was reigniting wasn't some theoretical chess move. It was about to land squarely on ordinary people, and most of them didn't even know it yet. Starting February 1st, 2026, a blanket 10% tariff was set to be imposed on goods coming into the United States from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, and Finland. Then, just a few months later on June 1st, that tariff would jump to 25%. Lars Harry explained it plainly, because there was no point sugarcoating it. Tariffs are paid by importers, and importers pass those costs on to consumers. Roughly 80% of the cost ends up hitting regular people. That meant higher prices on everything from food to clothing to luxury items that were already becoming inaccessible. He joked darkly about champagne, pointing out how absurdly expensive it had become even before these tariffs, how New Year's Eve had already felt like a financial endurance test. French wine, Scandinavian goods, German manufacturing, these weren't niche imports. They were woven into everyday life. And all of this, Lars Harry emphasized, was being done over Greenland, a territory the United States already had military bases in. A place that, until recently, most Americans barely thought about at all. France's response was swift and unsettling. President Emmanuel Macron urged the European Union to consider deploying what he called the trade bazooka, a mechanism designed to counter economic coercion. Lars Harry paused on that phrase because it sounded ridiculous until he realized how serious it actually was. This tool wasn't meant for allies. It was meant for adversaries. And yet here it was, being openly discussed in response to US actions. That alone should have set off alarm bells. When your closest allies start reaching for instruments designed to counter hostile states, something has gone very wrong. Lars Harry explained how Trump's negotiation style, going straight for the jugular, threatening maximum damage, then pretending compromise was generous, might work in certain business deals but was disastrous in diplomacy. Countries had options. They could trade with each other. They could form new alliances. They didn't need to tolerate economic bullying just because it came from Washington. He compared it, crudely but effectively, to a relationship where one partner issues ultimatums, only to be shocked when the other partner walks away. Power only worked when the other side believed you had something to offer besides threats. Meanwhile, Europe wasn't just responding with words. The Nordic alliance was mobilizing. Warships were being sent toward Greenland. Danish fighter jets were being launched. Lars Harry shook his head at how surreal it all sounded. When, exactly, were Americans supposed to feel like they were winning here? Because it didn't look like strength. It looked like isolation. Macron reiterated that Europe was committed to the sovereignty and independence of nations, a not-so-subtle reminder that Greenland was not America's to take. Lars Harry pointed out the irony: the United States was pushing its allies into negotiating solutions that deliberately excluded it. That was the opposite of leadership. That was how empires began to fracture. Then he turned to Stephen Miller's appearance on Fox News, where Miller attempted to justify the administration's stance with the confidence of someone who had never been forced to defend his ideas in a room full of skeptics. Miller argued that Greenland was 25% larger than Alaska, that Denmark was too small and too weak to defend it, that under centuries-old understandings of territorial control, Denmark had failed every test. Lars Harry couldn't help himself. He mocked the logic. NATO existed. Allied defense existed. Canada had already stated it would defend Greenland as part of its NATO commitments. The idea that Denmark stood alone was laughable. Lars Harry also couldn't ignore Miller himself. The man was only 40 years old, younger than Lars Harry by a few months, yet looked decades older. Lars Harry made a dark joke about how hatred and cruelty aged people, how the body struggled to keep up with the weight of terrible ideas. It was gallows humor, but it landed because it felt true. Miller framed the issue as unfair to American taxpayers, claiming the US was being forced to spend hundreds of billions defending a territory it didn't even own. Lars Harry countered that this was a gross distortion, a narrative designed to justify aggression. The administration wasn't protecting taxpayers. It was manufacturing consent. As if on cue, news broke that Denmark had launched fighter jets after Trump hinted he might pull the US out of NATO if Denmark didn't cooperate. Lars Harry emphasized how insane that was. NATO wasn't a bargaining chip. It was a cornerstone of global security. Threatening to abandon it over mineral-rich territory was reckless beyond measure. And then there was the Nordic alliance, something many Americans hadn't even realized existed in a formal sense. Countries that had once been seen as quiet, cooperative, almost boring on the world stage were now coordinating militarily in response to American pressure. Lars Harry called it weird, dangerous, and deeply unsettling. Not because these countries were aggressive, but because they were being forced into positions they never wanted to occupy. He brought it back to himself for a moment, talking about walking around with his passport, about being an American citizen born and raised in Rhode Island, about still believing rumor but refused to shy away from discussing allegations that Elon Musk may have had an affair with Katie Miller, Stephen Miller's wife, and possibly even fathered a child. Lars Harry stressed there was no confirmed proof, but he noted the timing, the professional overlap, Katie Miller's work for Musk, her sudden departure, and the podcast launch that followed. Musk's openly stated obsession with populating the world with his genetics didn't exactly make the rumor implausible. Lars Harry laughed it off, darkly, telling people to get DNA tests if needed. Humor was sometimes the only way to survive the absurdity, but beneath the jokes was a serious message. This was the world people were living in now. Billionaires, politicians, tech elites, all entangled, all insulated from consequences, all extracting wealth and power while regular people were told to blame immigrants, protesters, or each other. Lars Harry made it explicit, this wasn't left versus right anymore. That framing was obsolete. It was up versus down. The ultra-wealthy versus everyone else. They wanted people distracted. Fighting culture wars. Arguing over symbols. Meanwhile, the top fraction of a percent consolidated power at a scale that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Immigration was the scapegoat. So were Biden's policies. So was anything that kept attention away from systemic exploitation. Lars Harry ended the show the way he often did, with a reminder that love was stronger than hate, not as a slogan, but as a strategy for survival. Communities didn't survive by tearing themselves apart. They survived by recognizing common enemies and refusing to become what those enemies wanted them to be. He told viewers to hit the subscribe button, not because he needed the numbers, but because he believed in what Coravanta was doing. Talking about these things openly, twice a day, without fear, without pretense. He signed off with a grin and a nod to his team spirit, throwing in a final "Go Patriots" before promising to be back later that afternoon. He reminded everyone that this was Coravanta, that they were here every day, that the conversations would continue whether those in power liked it or not. And with that, Lars Harry signed off, leaving viewers with the uneasy sense that the world was shifting under their feet, and that pretending otherwise was no longer an option. Thanks for watching. Subscribe my channel. Coravanta.